Welcome back to the show. Today, I want to start with a mental exercise that I promise will completely reframe how you look at the evening news. Imagine waking up tomorrow and realizing that a single country on earth is responsible for manufacturing and selling nearly half of all the weapons on the entire planet. And we aren't just talking about a few rifles. We're talking advanced fighter jets, missile defense systems, naval destroyers actively supplied to over 100 different nations. Sit with that for a second. When you start viewing global conflict through the lens of a 42% market share, warfare stops looking like a timeline of clashing political ideologies. It starts looking like a highly optimized trillion-dollar corporate supply chain. Today, we are looking at warfare not as geopolitics, but as a corporate balance sheet. Our mission is to unpack the mechanics of how private defense companies actually influence global government decisions and policy. I've got a massive stack of research, historical economic data, federal budget figures, congressional lobbying expenditures, and the personal financial portfolios of the politicians making these decisions. But before we get into the numbers, which are genuinely staggering, I want to set a clear boundary. This is impartial economic analysis of publicly available data and historical mechanisms. It is not policy advocacy. We are exploring the math, the money, and the structural incentives that drive what appears to be a perpetual state of global conflict. Before we get into it, quick note. If this is the kind of analysis you come here for, hit the like button and subscribe. It's the single most useful signal you can send that this work is worth doing. Takes a second, means a lot. Now, let's get into it. To understand the modern defense industry, you have to rewind. Because the United States didn't start out as this global military industrial powerhouse we recognize today. The initial focus was massive territorial expansion. According to historical records, the country grew from about 1.1 million square kilometers to 9.87 million square kilometers. That's nearly a 9-fold increase in land mass. And naturally, securing that much new territory required a powerful military. But as powerful as the armed forces became, the real weapon being forged was the American economy itself. By 1890, the US was already the world's largest producer of steel and manufactured goods. The real inflection point in the data, though, is World War I. In 1913, reported US export figures were sitting at around $500 million. Then Europe went to war. The US stepped in to supply the Allied forces with everything: ammunition, rations, uniforms, materiel, the works. By 1916, according to those same historical export records, exports had skyrocketed to $5.5 billion. Read that again. A 10-fold jump in national exports in 3 years. The military expanded to match, going from a relatively small standing force of around 200,000 to an army of 4 million soldiers. The American assembly line was running red hot. But that red hot assembly line contained a critical mechanical flaw. And this flaw is the entire reason the modern defense industry exists in the shape we see today. When World War I ended in 1918, demand didn't just slow down, it evaporated overnight. The munitions factories closed their doors. Millions of soldiers returned home to a country that was no longer manufacturing at warp speed. The economic whiplash was devastating. According to reported historical unemployment data, the unemployment rate hit 11.4% in 1921, and by 1933, during the depths of the Great Depression, a staggering 25% of the American workforce was unemployed. 1 in 4 people had nothing to do. That is a terrifying economic freefall. Not just a recession, a generational scar on national memory. Then, World War II broke out, and suddenly the factories reopened. Millions went back to work in the manufacturing plants, and millions more went overseas to fight. That catastrophic unemployment rate reportedly plummeted from 14.6% down to just 1.9% in a matter of years. When the dust settled in 1945, Europe was in ruins. But the US wasn't just victorious. According to reported historical figures, they held around 70% of the entire world's gold reserves. 70%. They had the most powerful navy on the planet, they had nuclear technology, and they were standing on top of a mountain of wealth. And this is the exact moment the modern paradigm was established, because the federal government remembered that crushing 25% unemployment that followed the end of World War I. They realized that shutting down the war machine had caused domestic economic collapse. They could not afford to let the factories power down again. Think of it like a factory that realizes its most profitable product is an umbrella. At a certain point, the factory structurally needs it to rain forever, just to keep the lights on and the workers employed. They literally cannot afford a sunny day. So in 1947, President Harry Truman made a sweeping declaration. He positioned the US as a global guarantor, pledging to support democratic countries anywhere in the world facing threats. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, that declaration in 1947 was really the political and policy justification for maintaining wartime production levels during peacetime. It was a justification for the umbrellas. That single doctrine solidified what we now call the military-industrial complex. The US economy became reliant on global intervention to avoid another catastrophic depression. Peace, in a strictly economic sense, became a threat to the balance sheet. Fast forward to today. The system Truman put in place has matured into something enormous with an elaborate influence apparatus wrapped around it. Congressional lobbying expenditures by the defense industry are, according to reported figures, in the hundreds of millions of dollars per year. Of course, the rules are going to favor the team writing the checks. That is how any lobbying system works in any industry. But the impact of that shows up in the ratios of the federal budget. According to research on job creation impact per dollar of federal spending, education spending reportedly creates roughly 17 jobs for every 6 jobs created by an equivalent dollar of military spending. 17 versus 6. On pure job creation math, the case for investing in domestic priorities like schools or infrastructure over military production is straightforward, but that math is subordinated to a completely different set of incentives. Here's what this means for you as a citizen observing the budget process. When domestic priorities get consistently cut in favor of defense contracts, it isn't necessarily because defense creates more jobs. It's because defense has a much better organized apparatus for shaping which numbers policymakers see and which get quietly ignored. But the data reveals it goes much deeper than just campaign contributions. It ties directly into the personal financial portfolios of the decision makers themselves. The research details how members of Congress, particularly those sitting in top positions on the armed services committees, reportedly invest significant portions of their personal wealth into defense company stocks. Now think about the timeline of how that works. These specific committee members are the ones receiving classified intelligence briefings. They know in advance when a conflict is likely to escalate. They know when massive foreign military aid packages, like the multi-billion-dollar packages to Ukraine or Israel, are going to be drafted and pushed through Congress. They have literal advance notice of global demand for weaponry, and they know that the moment those aid packages are approved, arms production has to ramp up to fulfill the order. When a defense contractor gets a multi-billion-dollar government order, its stock price inevitably reacts upward. And because the politicians own those stocks, they are structurally positioned to personally profit from the very legislation they are drafting and passing. That is a staggering structural incentive. For a politician invested in this system, passing a bill for foreign military aid or approving a new military intervention doesn't just secure their campaign funding from lobbyists. It actively increases their personal net worth. Now, consider the alternative for that same politician. If they were to advocate for peace or vote to slash the defense budget in favor of funding domestic healthcare or infrastructure, which would create more jobs on the 17-6 ratio, they wouldn't just be losing their campaign donors, they would be actively depressing their own personal stock portfolios. The entire incentive structure of the legislative body for the specific members closest to these decisions is tilted toward perpetual global conflict. Because peace, mathematically, represents a personal financial loss for the decision makers. It's an endless war model, subsidized by the taxpayer through inflation and reduced public services that massively profits the private contractor and personally enriches the politician approving the contract. But this isn't just a domestic issue. The endless war model destabilizes global trade and impacts every country on earth. Because the US isn't just manufacturing these weapons to sit in domestic warehouses. It is the ultimate global supplier. According to reported arms trade data, the US currently commands around a 42% share of the entire global arms market. And they are actively selling advanced weaponry to over 107 different nations. Imagine the sheer scale of a single country outfitting nearly half the globe with weapons. How does a dual profit system of this magnitude, where the corporations and the politicians are both making billions, impact international stability? A 42% market share relies entirely on a world that is terrified of itself. It creates a self-sustaining ecosystem of insecurity. When the US engages in a conflict or funds a proxy war, other nations look at that global instability and panic. They feel vulnerable. Their natural response is to drastically increase their own national defense budgets to protect themselves. And because the US dominates the market, those terrified nations end up buying their advanced weapons directly from American companies. The fear itself is monetized. And there's a darker nuance in the data. Even when a country is actively fighting against the interests of the US, they often end up utilizing or purchasing American-made weapons through secondary markets. The weapons flow everywhere. Furthermore, when a country loses a conflict aligned against the US, standard operating procedure often includes installing a friendly government, and once that favorable government is in place, American defense and infrastructure companies are reliably given the contracts to move in and profit from the rebuilding process. They profit from the initial sale of the weapons, they profit from the destruction of the adversary, and then they profit from the subsequent reconstruction. It is a comprehensive monetization of conflict from start to finish. Which brings us to the ultimate consequence of outfitting over 100 nations with arms. American military dominance actually creates long-term financial instability for global markets. If your economy possesses a 42% market share in global arms, your manufacturing base, your corporate health, and your political wealth become structurally reliant on global instability. You cannot maintain that level of manufacturing output in a peaceful world. Therefore, the economic incentives of the world's largest superpower are inherently aligned with maintaining a constant low boil of global conflict. It perfectly illustrates why President Eisenhower's warning in 1961 about the military-industrial complex was so urgent and honestly so entirely ignored. The combination of the military, the politicians, and the defense companies has created an entrenched system where domestic priorities like that 17-6 job creation ratio between education and military spending are permanently subordinated to the needs of the defense industry. The wealth of the nation is continually exported in the form of weaponry rather than being invested internally. Here's what this means for you, and this is important. The true cost of this endless war model isn't just an abstract number on a congressional budget. It isn't just something that happens on a battlefield thousands of miles away. The cost is felt in your daily life. It's felt every time you go to the grocery store and feel the pinch of rising inflation, which is driven in significant part by trillions in deficit spending. It's felt when you pay rising fuel costs during periods of geopolitical stress. It's felt every time you hit a pothole on a crumbling public road or see a desperately underfunded public school. That is the real domestic costs of an economy that structurally prioritizes funding a global war machine over investing in its own citizens' quality of life, all while a select group of defense companies and their political allies watch their portfolios grow. Let me leave you with the fundamental question this whole analysis raises. We've walked through how the world's largest superpower has an economy that structurally requires global conflict to sustain its manufacturing base and its political wealth. So, what would actually happen to the global economy if world peace were suddenly achieved? Can a system built entirely on producing weapons actually survive without an adversary? Go back to that umbrella factory we opened with. If the factory only knows how to make umbrellas, what happens to the town when it finally stops raining? The workers on that assembly line still need to feed their families. The politicians still need to fund their campaigns. The shareholders still need their quarterly returns. And a nation whose entire industrial identity was rebuilt around perpetual demand for umbrellas isn't going to accept a sunny day without a fight, which suggests something uncomfortable. The umbrella factory doesn't have an obvious plan for what to build if it ever stops raining. And when a factory that big doesn't have a plan, its incentive isn't to invent a new product line. It's to make sure the forecast keeps calling for storms. That is the fundamental math behind the modern military-industrial complex. And it's something worth sitting with the next time you watch the evening news, read a headline about a foreign aid package, or look at your grocery bill and wonder where your paycheck actually went. Thanks for going down this one with me. I'll see you on the next.